It happened on a quiet night in a wealthy neighborhood, a scene that should have been ordinary, but instead turned into a lesson on prejudice, dignity, and power. Blue and red lights tore through the stillness, sirens screaming as if danger lurked in the shadows. But there was no danger. There was only James Carter, a black man, tired after a long day, unlocking the door to his own home. To the police, though, that simple act was enough to make him a suspect. "Step away from the car. Hands where we can see them." The officer's voice cut through the night, harsh and commanding. In that instant, James wasn't seen as a homeowner, or as the man who had poured years of sacrifice into every brick of the house behind him. He wasn't seen as a neighbor, a taxpayer, or a respected professional. He wasn't even seen as human in that moment. No, he was seen as a black man in the wrong place, and that was all they needed to justify their suspicion, their guns and their arrogance. James froze for a second, his briefcase still in hand. His pulse quickened, not out of guilt, but out of the heavy awareness of how fragile this moment was. He had heard the stories. Black men pulled over, questioned, pinned to the ground, sometimes worse. Now he wasn't reading those headlines. He was standing in one. "I live here," James said calmly, his voice even, though anger already pressed against his chest. "This is my home." But his words rolled off their armor of prejudice. A second officer moved closer, flashlight blinding his eyes, as though the light might reveal some hidden crime. "We got a call about a suspicious male entering the property," the officer said, his tone cold, rehearsed. "You fit the description." James almost laughed at the absurdity, but the weight of the guns at their sides reminded him this was no laughing matter. "Suspicious male?" he repeated. "I'm the homeowner." The first officer scoffed. "Yeah? We'll see about that. ID, now." James swallowed hard. Every movement mattered now. He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, raising his wallet high before passing it over. He had learned long ago that quick gestures could be misread. That fear behind the badge could become deadly in a split second. The officer snatched the wallet, flipping it open carelessly. He barely looked at the driver's license before speaking into his radio. "Run the name James Carter. Claims he lives here." As the call went through, the other officers spread out, surrounding him like he was a threat. Their boots crunched against the driveway gravel, their hands still hovering over their weapons. From behind curtains and half-open blinds, neighbors watched. Some held their phones up, recording silently. Others simply stared, unwilling to step in, unwilling to risk their own comfort to defend a man they had waved to just days before. James stood tall, refusing to shrink, though his insides churned with frustration. He thought of his parents, who had worked themselves to the bone so he could break barriers. He thought of his younger brother, who often reminded him, "Don't forget, Jay, they don't see your degree first. They see your skin." And he thought of the bitter irony that after years of loyalty to his country, years of serving justice, tonight he was treated like a criminal in his own driveway. The radio crackled back. The officer listened, then nodded, his expression tight. "Name checks out," he muttered, handing the wallet back without meeting James's eyes. "But we're gonna need more than that." James exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. He took his wallet, pulled it open himself, and held it up to the nearest flashlight. "Maybe you should actually look," he said, his voice lower now, steady but edged with steel. The officer frowned, leaning closer. His beam illuminated the small, gold-rimmed badge tucked inside. For a moment, confusion flickered across his face, followed quickly by discomfort. He leaned back, blinking, trying to regain control of the situation. "What's this supposed to be?" he asked, his voice less certain. James locked eyes with him, unblinking. "That," he said, "is a federal badge. I'm an agent with the FBI, and right now, you're standing on my property, accusing me of breaking into my own home." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The younger officer shifted his weight nervously, lowering his hand from his holster. Another glanced at his partner, clearly rattled. The lead officer's jaw tightened, pride wrestling with the humiliation creeping across his face. James took a step forward, his presence commanding. He no longer spoke like a man defending himself. He spoke like a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. "You see a black man in a nice neighborhood, and your first thought isn't homeowner. It's criminal. You didn't ask questions. You didn't wait for answers. You saw me and you assumed." His voice rose, sharp enough to cut through the thick night air. "And tonight you assumed wrong." Behind the windows, neighbors whispered louder now. Phones recorded every second. What had started as another routine stop was unraveling, exposing itself for what it was, not protection, not safety, but prejudice in uniform. The officers shifted uneasily, but James didn't give them space to recover. "You humiliated me in front of my own home," he said. "You tried to strip me of my dignity, my place, my humanity, but you couldn't. Because you didn't realize who you were dealing with. I'm not just James Carter, the man who owns this house. I'm Special Agent Carter of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And believe me when I say this, every single thing you've done tonight is going in my report." The power balance shifted in an instant. Where moments before they stood taller, now they shrank. Their authority cracked wide open. James had taken back control, not just for himself, but for every man who had been stopped, searched, or questioned simply for existing in his own skin. And though the night wasn't over, one truth was clear: these officers had picked the wrong man to target. The silence lingered, thick and suffocating, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. For a moment, the flashing red and blue lights seemed to dim beneath the weight of James Carter's words. He stood firm, his badge glinting in the beam of a flashlight, while the officers shifted uneasily around him. The lead officer, his jaw stiff, his pride bruised, cleared his throat. "Agent Carter," he said, forcing the title out like it burned his tongue. "We were just responding to a call. A concerned citizen reported suspicious activity." James tilted his head, his voice cold but deliberate. "Suspicious activity? I drove into my driveway. I pulled my briefcase out of my car. That was the suspicious activity?" He stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "No, let's call it what it is. Someone saw a black man in this neighborhood and decided I didn't belong. And instead of questioning the bias behind that call, you decided to act on it." The officer's lips pressed thin, but James wasn't finished. His voice rose, carrying across the street, loud enough for every neighbor at their windows to hear. "Do you have any idea how often this happens? How many times black men and women are accused of crimes they didn't commit? How many lives are destroyed because someone assumed guilt based on skin color? Tonight, you didn't just stop me. You became part of a system that has been breaking people like me for generations." The younger officer looked down at his boots, shame flickering in his eyes. Another fidgeted, glancing at the recording phones across the street. The lead officer, though, stayed rigid, his pride refusing to yield. "With respect, Agent Carter," he said. The words tense. "We were doing our jobs." James's laugh was bitter, cutting through the night. "Doing your jobs? Your job is to protect. Your job is to serve. Not to humiliate an innocent man in front of his home. Not to treat his existence as a crime." His voice dropped lower now, steadier, like steel. "You forgot the oath you swore, but I haven't forgotten mine." He reached into his briefcase slowly and deliberately, pulling out a sleek folder embossed with the seal of the Bureau. He flipped it open, revealing documents and credentials that left no doubt of his authority. "I investigate corruption," James said firmly. "I expose misconduct. I've spent my career holding men accountable when they step outside the law. So believe me when I tell you, tonight won't be swept under the rug." A murmur rippled across the neighborhood. The neighbors weren't just watching anymore. They were bearing witness. What had begun as silent curiosity transformed into quiet recognition. The truth was on James Carter's side. The lead officer shifted, sweat glistening under the harsh streetlight. He tried to find footing, to reclaim a shred of authority. "Look, Agent Carter, maybe we overstepped. But you have to understand, calls like these, we don't get to pick and choose." James cut him off sharply. "Yes, you do. Every officer has a choice. A choice to listen, to question, to de-escalate. A choice to see a man instead of a threat. You had that choice. And you failed." The younger officer stepped forward slightly, his voice softer, hesitant. "Agent Carter." "We didn't know." James turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "Exactly. You didn't know. You didn't know who I was, and because of that, you thought you could treat me any way you wanted. That is the problem. It shouldn't take a federal badge to earn your respect. It shouldn't take power or rank to be treated like a human being." He paused, his voice cracking slightly, the raw truth in it silencing even the crickets. "It should be enough that I am a man, that I am a citizen, that I belong here. But to you, it wasn't." The words sank into the air like heavy stones. For the first time, the lead officer lowered his gaze, the arrogance in his stance faltering. From across the street, the woman who had been recording whispered to her husband, "He's right. They didn't see him. They saw what they wanted to see." Her husband nodded, his phone still raised, capturing every second. James exhaled, steadying himself. His anger was sharp, but beneath it lay something deeper: exhaustion. The exhaustion of carrying dignity, like armor in a world that so often tried to strip it away. He glanced around, seeing the neighbors, the officers, the flashing lights. He realized this moment wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. "I want the name of the caller," James demanded, his tone clipped. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The lead officer shifted uncomfortably. "We can't—" "You will," James interrupted, his authority undeniable. "That false report didn't just waste resources, it endangered my life. And if you think I won't pursue it, you're wrong. Because this isn't just about me. It's about accountability." The officers hesitated, but James's badge left little room for argument. The younger one finally nodded. "We'll file it," he said quietly. James stepped closer, his presence towering, though his voice remained calm. "I will follow up personally. And if I find out this department tries to bury what happened tonight, I will make sure the truth is heard. Every word. Every detail." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. The officers shifted back, no longer predators circling their prey, but men standing exposed, stripped of power by the very man they had tried to diminish. James closed his briefcase, the click of its latch sounding final, like a gavel striking. "You came here to treat me like a trespasser," he said, his voice resonating with quiet force. "But I am not the one who trespassed tonight." "You did. You trespassed on my dignity, on my rights, on my home." The neighborhood was silent. Save for the hum of the police radios and the soft whir of recording phones, the officers had no response. They had walked onto his property thinking they held the power, but now, stripped bare, they realized the truth. James Carter was no ordinary man. He was the FBI, and more importantly, he was a black man who refused to bow to prejudice. The reckoning wasn't over, but the balance had shifted. The flashing lights eventually faded as the officers retreated to their cars, their voices low, their pride wounded. But the night was far from over for James Carter. He stood in his driveway long after the engines hummed and the street fell quiet again, the echo of the confrontation still burning in his chest. His neighbors' blinds slid shut one by one, yet the weight of their silence lingered. He knew that tomorrow morning, whispers would ripple through the cul-de-sac, retelling the story of the black man the police thought didn't belong. But James also knew this story wasn't going to be confined to whispers. Not anymore. He walked into his home, placed his briefcase on the counter, and sat in the dim glow of his kitchen light. He poured himself a glass of water, but his hands trembled as he lifted it. Not from fear, but from the surge of emotions that came rushing in now, that the immediate danger had passed. Anger, frustration, a tiredness that ran deeper than the bone, and beneath it all, a question that had haunted him for years. How many more nights like this would there be? By morning, James had his answer. There would be as many nights as people allowed, which meant he had to act. The very next day, he called his bureau superior and filed a detailed report of the incident, attaching names, badge numbers, and every word that had been exchanged. He didn't stop there. He contacted the city's police commissioner directly, setting up a meeting. He wasn't just reporting misconduct, he was demanding accountability. When the meeting came, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Uniformed officers sat at the table, their faces stony, their defenses ready. Across from them, James sat tall, his bureau badge resting on the polished wood, gleaming like a silent witness. "I want to be clear," James began, his voice firm but measured. "This isn't about one bad call. This isn't about a misunderstanding. This is about a culture, a pattern. The assumption that a black man in a nice neighborhood must be up to no good. The willingness to treat him as a suspect before you treat him as a human being." The commissioner shifted, uneasy. "Agent Carter, we regret what happened." James raised a hand, stopping him cold. "Regret isn't enough. Regret doesn't erase humiliation. Regret doesn't stop the next man from being pinned to the ground, or the next child from seeing their father treated like a criminal for existing." His tone sharpened. "What I demand is change, training, accountability, and consequences for the officers who forgot their oath." The room fell silent. The officers avoided his eyes, their shame undeniable. For once, they weren't the ones in control. News of the confrontation spread. The videos recorded by neighbors found their way online, sparking outrage. Headlines told the story, Black FBI agent accused of trespassing on his own property. Social media erupted with anger, voices demanding justice, voices recognizing their own experiences in James's humiliation. And slowly the tide began to turn. The department announced an internal review. The officers involved were suspended pending investigation. Mandatory bias training programs were introduced citywide. It wasn't everything James wanted, but it was a start. A ripple that he hoped would grow into a wave. But for James, the true resolution wasn't in suspensions or policy memos. It came one evening, weeks later, when he walked his street again. This time, no squad cars followed. No suspicious stares trailed him. Instead, neighbors who had once stayed silent now approached. The woman who had filmed the incident shook his hand, her eyes brimming with guilt. "I should have spoken up that night," she admitted. "I was afraid, but watching you gave me courage." Her words pierced him, but they also steadied him. He realized that his fight hadn't just defended himself, it had lit a spark in others. Standing there under the same streetlight where it had all begun, James Carter understood something profound. He hadn't chosen to be the example that night, but fate had placed him there. And by standing tall, by refusing to bow to humiliation, he had turned a moment of prejudice into a moment of power. He thought of his parents again, of their sacrifices. He thought of his brother's warnings. He thought of every black man who had been stopped, searched, questioned, or worse, and he knew he carried all of them with him. So he raised his head, his voice calm but resolute, speaking words that would echo far beyond his street. "They tried to make me a suspect in my own home, but I am not their suspect. I am not their assumption. I am not their fear. I am James Carter, an agent of the FBI, a homeowner, a son, a brother, a man. And no badge, no uniform, no prejudice will ever strip me of that truth." The night air was cool, steady against his skin. He walked back to his door, his steps sure, his shoulders squared. For the first time since that night, he felt the weight begin to lift. Because dignity once defended cannot be taken. And James Carter had defended his with the strength of a man who knew that the fight was bigger than himself. The story of that night would be told again and again, not as a tale of trespassing, but as a testament to pride, courage, and justice. A reminder that no matter how deeply rooted prejudice may be, it will always break against the unshakable truth of dignity. And somewhere, perhaps in another neighborhood, another black man would hear James Carter's story, and when faced with his own moment of judgment, he too would stand tall.